past and on your presence in our history. Help us to discern your will, your providence in our past and in our own lives in the present. We pray this through the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. St. Benedict, pray for us. St. Catherine, pray for us. Father and Son. Okay, welcome back. Those of you who are back, and welcome to some new faces. I'm going to kind of experiment a little bit here, so bear with me. Somebody took my really nice stand that I used last week, so it's disappeared. So I've got this one, which is lower, so it's not quite comfortable for me to stand and do it, so I may try to sit, but I'd really kind of rather stand. So I may be up and down a little bit. I'm really not sure what I'm going to do, but as I say, just bear with me. So the way I usually begin these subsequent classes is with tying up loose ends from the previous class. And a lot of that has to do with correcting mistakes that I made, because I always make some. So I want to do that for those of you who were here last week. Now this first one probably doesn't matter so much because all of you knew I was misspeaking when I said it. But my wife, and what our spouse is for, other than to point out our errors, right? My wife pointed this out, that I said something like Abraham and his son Jacob. So, of course, Jacob was not Abraham's son. Isaac was Abraham's son, and Jacob was Isaac's son. But as I said, you already knew that. Another one, I think I misspoke. I'm not 100% sure. I did go back to the video, but I was not going to listen to myself for an hour, and I couldn't find it quickly, so I'm not totally sure about it. But when I was talking about early church historians, and I think I said Irenaeus when I meant to say Eusebius. So really, is that what did I say Eusebius? I did say Eusebius. Okay, great. I didn't mess that one up. All right, and then the other two are just kind of follow-ups. Somebody asked about early sources, and I talked about the Didache, although I said I didn't know much about it. I said that I thought it was from the 1st century, maybe from the 2nd. It turns out that that wild guess was actually exactly correct, because we actually don't know exactly when it dates from. Some historians say the 2nd century, but most historians say the 1st century. So somewhere there in the early church, its title or its subtitle was The Teaching of the Apostles. So this was an early catechism, if you will. And it does talk about the things that I thought it talked about, which was early church practice, the liturgy, and also some of the teachings of the church. A lot of people point to it as the first kind of statement on the morality of abortion and contraception in the church. It begins this kind of consistent teaching of the church on those questions. So all of that in the Didache from probably the 1st century, very early on. And then finally, we did have one diligent young student who was looking for the video that I mentioned at Amos Library, and so I wanted to give you the title of that. It's one in a series that the History Channel did called Ancient Civilizations, and the title of this one is Jesus is Jerusalem. That's the one I was referring to. That's the one I've shown other classes. I think it's really good for kind of giving you a feel of what Jerusalem was at the time of Jesus and how much we know about that and how much we're still discovering about that, even in the present. I mean, this archaeological work is still going on, so we're still learning more and more about it. But as I searched for that, I discovered there's actually a lot of other videos with similar titles about similar subjects at the library, available as e-videos through the library. So there's lots of good stuff out there. Just take your pick. But that was the title of that, Jesus is Jerusalem, in that Ancient Civilization series. Okay, that's that. Any other questions or loose ends we need to settle from last week? All right, so last week we came up to more or less the 4th century, 400s. This time, we're going to try to cover 1,200 years of church history. So, we simply cannot do that, all right? And so I think the better way to think about what we're doing tonight in terms of covering the medieval church, as you see on the screen there, the Middle Ages, is that it's kind of like a pond. The Middle Ages are a big pond or a river, and we're just going to skip a stone across it, and we're going to touch down in 2 or 3 places, okay? And that's the way we're going to do this. So I'm going to talk about a few things that I think are especially important or interesting or relevant, but we're not going to cover the entire history of the medieval church tonight. So as you may recall from last week, we ended with St. Augustine, and as I suggested, he was this transitional figure between the early church and the medieval church, because he was around at the time that the Roman Empire in the West was falling. Now, the fall of the Roman Empire had lots of consequences, okay? And one of those was the increasing separation of East from West within the church. Actually, sorry, we'll come back to that in just 1 second. There was something else I forgot to cover. I was going to come back to first. So, here's that. I overheard someone say that they wished that I would have covered something about the church council. So, that's all I need to hear to get me to go over a topic that I wanted to cover, but I didn't have a chance to. So, as I mentioned last time, the church, the first couple centuries of the church were characterized by persecution, right? Well, once the persecution is over, once Constantine legalizes Christianity, then the church has, you might say, the luxury of worrying about things like the finer points in theology, all right? So the early church, Jesus was the Son of God. He was God and man. There was the incarnation. That's what the incarnation meant. And that was good enough. In the face of persecution, in the attempt to evangelize, to spread the faith, that was good enough. Well, as the church matured, and academics and philosophers and theologians started thinking more deeply about these issues, all sorts of controversies arose about what exactly does that mean. This is what academics do when we think too much. We start to cause trouble. Okay? Well, that's what happened in the early church. So we started to see arise some ideas that were questionable, controversial. What was the truth about what it meant that Jesus Christ was, in fact, both God and man? That's not, I mean, the statement of it can be kind of simple, but when you start to really think about that, how does that play out in reality? It's kind of difficult. We don't have a lot of experience with that ourselves. No one in this room is both God and man, right? Not that I'm aware of. We probably haven't met anybody in the flesh that we know who's God and man. So what does that mean? And so there was this whole period of hashing out what it meant to be, as we would say now, small o, Orthodox Christian, or Orthodox Catholic. What the mainstream in Christian theology would be. And so there were a series of councils held over the first few centuries of the church after its legalization. Put that one up, yes. So the Council of Nicaea, the first Council of Nicaea, dealt with the heresy of Arianism, which was, in essence, all of these were enormously complicated. Okay, I'm going to boil them down for you. Basically, Arianism was an emphasis on Christ's humanity at the expense of his divinity. Okay? The Orthodox position on the Incarnation was a kind of balancing of the divinity and the humanity. Recognition that he was fully God, and fully man at the same time. And that these two parts of him, what we end up calling them our natures, that these two natures are perfectly fused in the person of Jesus Christ, in the second person of the Trinity. So Arianism, it took a while to get rid of that. You see, we needed two councils for that. Nicaea and Constantinople. This is, by the way, the first council of Nicaea, 325. That was called by the Emperor Constantine. And from it we derive the term the Nicene Creed, which you are all familiar with because you say it every Sunday at Mass. Technically, it's the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, but Nicene's a lot easier to say, so we just do Nicene, because most of it came from the Council of Nicaea, but little bits of it also came from Constantinople, which is the second one you see there. Now, just as we were finishing up with this problem with Arianism, another heresy arose, which was Nestorianism. This was an attempt to redress problems with Arianism. So, all right, we want to be careful not overemphasizing Christ's humanity, right? We need to be sure that we preserve his divinity. Well, the way we do that is by separating those natures, the divine and the human natures, that they're not totally fused. Because if they're totally fused, the divine is going to take over the human, right? So we separate those. And therefore, once we do that, then, You can't say, for example, that Mary is the mother of God. She's just the mother of Jesus' divine nature. She's not the mother of God. So, Council of Ephesus at 431 is where we get the title, Theotokos, Mother of God, where the Council of Fathers declared that this was, in fact, an accurate, legitimate title for Mary. Not so much about Mary, of course, but what it said about Jesus, that the divine and human natures were perfectly fused in what they call the hypostatic union. As we say in the Nicene Creed, Jesus Christ was consubstantial with the Father, right? The substance of He and the Father were perfectly one, even as His divine and human natures were perfectly one. Okay, and then monophysitism, you can see there the Council of Chalcedon or Chalcedon, 451. The Monophysites said, okay, yeah, the Nestorians got it wrong. We're going to get it right. So what we'll do is we'll perfectly fuse the two natures. But because the divine nature is divine, the human nature is subsumed in the divine nature. So they're no longer two distinct natures that are united in the hypostatic union. Instead, one is subservient to the other. We still have a similar problem that we have with Nestorianism, which is that we no longer have a Christ who is fully human, but instead the divinity is overemphasized. And so Chalcedon addressed that one. Constantinople, the same things. Constantinople III, however you say that, monothelitism. Monothelitism, there we go. This was the question of Jesus' wills. I won't go into that one. Suffice it to say Jesus has two wills, not one. And then iconoclasm, which was the last of what are considered the early church councils. These are the councils that almost all Christians accept, okay? Protestants, Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholics all accept these first 7 councils. Iconoclasm dealt with the issue of whether images could be properly used in the context of Christian worship. Could we have statues of saints, icons of saints, and so forth?
Kevin,
okay.
was that in response? Because by 787, hadn't Islam started, which is definitely
right.
non-iconic.
We're going to talk a little bit about Islam later, but there is a connection. Some actually beginning with the Constantinople III, and then also Nicaea II. Some people, it's a debatable point, it's a controversial point, but some suggest that it was the influence of Islam that led to those, that was at least in part due to those heresies, because that Islam emphasizes the will, okay, the will of God, and so the idea that Jesus could have two wills, one human and one divine, was anathema to the Islamic understanding of God, and so maybe that had something to do with the rise of this heresy. And iconoclasm, the same thing. Islam is buried in images, no sacred images, right? No pictures of Muhammad in any way, shape, or form. So, as I say, it's debatable, but it may happen. The timing is obviously, as you suggest, the timing is coincidental, at least. Okay, so those are the early councils, and as I indicated, these first 7 are accepted, as I said, by Eastern, Western, non-Catholic Christian, all Christians. That points to the fact that not all Christians accept the councils that occurred after that. And so that's the story, in part, of this division between East and West that I started talking about at the beginning of the session. So there's a political story going on within the Roman Empire. You might say within the secular political realm, okay? But that secular story has a major impact on the religious story, on the story of the church. And this is true throughout history. But you can see this in particular in this case with this division between East and West. Now, there was always tension. As soon as the church started spreading throughout the Mediterranean, there was tension between different schools of theology, different understandings of Christianity. You can see this, again, going back to that book we talked so much about last week, the Acts of the Apostles, right? You can see different people following different figures. Paul talks about this. And this continues into the later centuries of the church. And as there is political division within what used to be the Roman Empire, so the Eastern Empire I mentioned last week, the Eastern Empire survives. It becomes known as the Byzantine Empire, okay? The Roman Empire in the East survives all the way down to the 1450s. But in the West, the Roman Empire is swept away and barbarians take over. And so, as that happens, there's less unity within the church, and lots of different facets to that. There are theological aspects, there are cultural aspects. Remember I talked about the importance of language last week, and the way that the Greek language united the Mediterranean world. It also united the church in its early centuries, including discussions of theology, its use in the liturgy, and these sorts of things. Well, Latin gradually became the language of the Western Empire. Okay? And as Latin became the language of the Western Empire, and then the empire was split, pretty soon you have theologians, church figures, bishops in the East talking to each other and worshiping in Greek, and you have the Latins talking to each other and worshiping in Latin. And that may not seem like such a big deal, but when you're talking about these abstruse theological points, terminology is everything, and pretty soon you have these two camps having difficulty communicating with each other. At least that's part of the story. And so gradually you have a separation between East and West. This really occurs over many centuries. There are various controversies and various chapters in the story, but it culminates in the 11th century when a representative of the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, the head of the church in the West, is in Constantinople trying to negotiate with the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Byzantine Emperor, and the talks break down, and they end up, the Pope's legate, the Pope's representative, and the Patriarch of Constantinople, who's the head of the church in the East, they excommunicate each other. Okay? And that's known as the Great Eastern Schism. That's kind of the definitive break between Eastern and Western Christianity, and that split, that division is still with us today. So if you're familiar with Eastern Orthodoxy, Russian Orthodoxy, Greek Orthodoxy, any of those terms, that's all part of this. They all come out of this Eastern half of Christianity, which you may recall, those of you who are as old as I am or older, John Paul II would talk about this wound in the church, and he'd say the church needs to repair this breach so that it can breathe again with two lungs. His idea was that as long as Roman Catholicism, what we think about as Roman Catholicism, the church in the West, Latin Christianity, as long as it's separated from the East, we're missing something. We're missing the mysticism, the sacredness of the liturgy, the music, and everything that Eastern Orthodoxy is known for. We're missing that, and at the same time, Eastern Orthodoxy is missing what the strengths of the West are. So we're still trying to heal that breach. Kind of a little piece of a late chapter of that story is that immediately following Vatican II, as kind of part of the proceedings of the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, those excommunications were lifted. So the Pope, for his part, the Patriarch of Constantinople, they lifted those excommunications, so those are no longer in effect. But by that time, almost 1,000 years of separation, different tradition, different customs, different church politics developing, so it's proving very, very difficult to bring the two back together in a formal way. But attempts continue. Okay, so this is a slide. I think it popped up last week briefly. Maybe some of you remember it. But this is just kind of a graphic representation of this division in Christianity. And I've mentioned the division between East and West, that kind of basic division. But in fact, there were divisions that took place within Christianity almost from the beginning. And this is why the council stuff that I did just a few minutes ago becomes relevant. Because it was often in the wake of those councils that these divisions within the church crept in. So, those of you, again, old enough to remember the Second Vatican Council and its aftermath know that, well, in some respects, we're still dealing with divisions in the church that entered after the Second Vatican Council. Lots of debate about how to implement it and how to apply it and whether to accept it and all those kinds of things. Well, that was nothing new. And in fact, for many of these early church councils, there were actually formal splits within the church, complete breaks within the unity of the church. And so this is depicting some of those. I don't know how it appears. Well, that's pretty clear. Most of you can read that, maybe. Okay? So just to very briefly kind of summarize these, because I think it's interesting. I didn't know much about this at all until the recent past. So to start with the Council of Ephesus, remember that was 431. There were parts of the church that did not accept the finding, the rulings of the Council of Ephesus. So they embraced Nestorianism, which we think of, consider to be a heresy. They considered that to be the Orthodox position. They would not compromise, and so they continued to practice Christianity in that fashion. And this church still exists. It's known, I think mostly it's known as the Church of the East. It's in places like Syria and farther east. This is the church that, after 431, this is the church that was present in, for example, Persia. Persia, modern-day Iran, we don't think of that as a Christian country, right? What is it? Iran? Muslim, right. Shia. Very, very Muslim, okay? It was completely Christian in the 5th century. Completely Christian. It was a stronghold of Christianity. But after 431, it was Nestorian Christianity, and that church continued to grow and to develop until Islam took its place. And actually, there were Nestorian missionaries who reached China early on, in the 5th or 6th century. Christianity came to China very early. And then the Council of Chalcedon, 451. Okay, remember that was the Monophysite or Monophysite heresy. And that gave rise to what are sometimes called the Oriental Orthodox churches. And I was going to bring up a specific example here because I think there might be someone in the room who has some connection to Ethiopia. Anyone? Okay. You know anything about the church in Ethiopia? No? Okay. The church in Ethiopia is very ancient. Like Persia, the Ethiopian church dates way back. Well, the claim is, the traditional claim is that it was actually evangelized by the apostles. But for sure, by the late 200s, Christianity was in Ethiopia. We don't know anything about Ethiopia as Catholic Christians at this point because it became separated from Roman Catholicism, just like Persia did after the Council of Chalcedon. So these are the Monophysite churches, Oriental Orthodox. It's a species of Eastern or Eastern Orthodox church. And the Ethiopian church is one of those. The Coptic church, sometimes you hear about them, it's mostly in Egypt. They're dealing with being a substantial sized minority in what is nonetheless a dominantly Muslim country. So there's tension at least, conflict sometimes, violence unfortunately often between those groups in Egypt, which is why it comes into the news occasionally. So all of those traditions, continued, and Eastern Orthodoxy the same way. The Great Schism that I just talked about after the excommunications in the 11th century, that's the next big split. And so all of that serves to kind of shear off all of this Eastern Christianity from the West. And that also bespeaks the point that what we're doing from here on out, as I continue to talk about the Church of the Middle Ages, and then the Reformation and modernity and beyond, I'm talking about the Western Church, okay? Roman Catholicism specifically. But just be aware of the fact that if you're conceptualizing church history more generally, or the history of Christianity, there's all this other stuff going on all over the world that's not connected to Roman Catholicism, but we're focusing on Catholicism. That's enough for us to try to do.
I was just looking at the Eastern Orthodoxy, but then we have some Eastern rites that then joined at that point. They're accepted by the Roman Catholic Church, I'm sure, like Marianite Catholics and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So when would that have been? Like that they broke off from the Eastern to go to the West.
Yeah, exactly. That's a very, very complicated story. So there are, if I have the number right, I think there are 21 or 23 Eastern Catholic churches. So for the most part, these are churches that were part of these other traditions. So there's an Ethiopian one, for example. There's a couple of them in India, the Syro-Malabar and the Syro-Malankara. There's the Maronite, which is mostly in Lebanon. There's a Coptic Catholic, mostly in Egypt. So all of these were part of these other traditions. And then at some point along the line, as you indicate, some point along the line, in most cases, many centuries later, a lot of this happened in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, even later. I think India was later than that. parts of those other traditions decided that they wanted to reunite with Rome. They recognized that under the leadership of the papacy, Roman Catholicism was in fact the truest or most valid kind of continuation of the early church. That was the mainstream tradition, and so they wanted to reunite with that. And so they made overtures to Rome, and they would make agreements, and that's why everyone is its own story, really. So you can't kind of summarize it all, but in general, that's the way it worked. Rome would make some kind of agreement, often accommodations. So you'll see, I don't know how much anyone knows about the Eastern Rite Catholics, but we don't have a lot of experience with it in this immediate area. But most of them, well, I think all of them, they basically retain their liturgical, their language, traditions from those older traditions that they emerged out of. So
I have one who was married in a Catholic.
yeah,
and
okay.
They do. They have the divine liturgy.
Yeah, they've got a different liturgy. In fact, I would assume that the liturgy looks exactly like it does in, I don't know where the Maronites. The Maronites are kind of a special case, so let me leave them aside. An easier one would be, say, the Byzantine or the Ukrainian. They emerged out of the Greek Orthodox Church. So, or Ukrainian, Russian Orthodox, it's kind of all the same. So their liturgy would look exactly like a Russian Orthodox or a Greek Orthodox liturgy. But they're in full communion with the Pope. Okay, they're considered Catholic, they're Ukrainian Catholic or Byzantine Catholic. They would still, do the liturgy in Greek and whatever else is, or Ukrainian, I don't know. Ukrainian, what, Bill? Anything? I don't know what language they use. It's Greek.
I don't, but Joe, my son Joe's been to both,
Okay.
and he says they're the same.
Okay.
He's been to a Russian Orthodox
Right.
service and Ukrainian Catholic, and he says they're the same.
Right.
They stand throughout the, you go into details,
Yeah.
they stand throughout the service,
Yeah.
everything's sung.
And you've got the screen
The screen,
between
yeah.
the sanctuary and the congregation.
Our sister parish is in Russia, so what are
Yes.
their beliefs in that area?
Yeah, I know somebody who knows more about that would know. I think they're Roman Catholic.
They are,
actually.
it's a
Latin
Roman,
Catholic.
yeah, they're Latin, right.
Yeah. But there's probably other parishes nearby that are, well, I don't know, not out there, but certainly throughout Russia there would be Eastern Rite Catholics who are in unity with Rome, but are not Latin Rite. They don't do our Mass. They do the Eastern Mass. Divine Liturgy, as they call it, not Mass. Yes.
Exactly.
Could you help me understand the historian Christianity from the Council of Sicily? I didn't quite know all that. Nestorian?
Oh,
Not
yeah, Nestorian, right. So, there it is. Nestorianism was a heresy. So,
Can you help me understand heresy? I don't understand.
oh, yeah, sorry. No, good question. Yeah. Always feel free to raise your hands, ask questions if you're not following some. So heresy would be a theological position, belief, tenet that is at odds with the Orthodox understanding. Literally, I think the term means something like wrong belief. Okay, so orthodoxy is right, orthogonal is right, ortho is right. Okay, so orthodoxy is right belief. Okay, and heresy would be something that diverges from that. That's the simple answer. There's technical theological stuff about what constitutes heresy and what's just false teaching or error or whatever, but that's the basic idea.
You partially alluded to this, but do all of these groups claim succession from the apostles?
Yes, I would say so. Yeah. And in fact, that's a good question because it gets into another interesting theological issue, which is the matter of episcopal succession. So the Roman Catholic Church, there's so many different versions of these things now. I can't say with absolute certainty that it's everyone, but in general, the Roman Catholic Church recognizes the validity of episcopal succession within Eastern Orthodox churches. So their laying on of hands is legitimate because they've Their line of succession from the apostles is unbroken, and they're still practicing the sacraments in the same way, basically, in the same essential way that the Catholic Church recognizes as legitimate. So their Eucharist is valid. They're actually confecting the body and blood of Jesus Christ, just as we are in a Roman Catholic Church. Their other sacraments, marriage and holy orders, are all legitimate. So we recognize their bishops, we recognize their priests, we recognize their Mass, all the sacraments. It's just that they don't recognize the primacy of Peter, the primacy of the Bishop of Rome, as being the head of the church. Now, there are some other issues as well. Some minor for me, they seem like minor theological issues. For Eastern Orthodox, maybe not so much. The filioque question, which is, do we say that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father, or do we say that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son? In our Nicene Creed, what do we say? We say the Holy Spirit who proceeds from the Father and the Son. Right. Do you know that was a really, really controversial statement? Okay? Because the Orthodox believe that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father alone. So that and the Son clause was added later in the Nicene Creed, after the Council of Nicaea, after the Council of Constantinople. And the Eastern Orthodox didn't like that. They actually have a pretty good case on that one. But on the theological question, I don't know. It doesn't seem like that big of a deal to me, but I'm not a theologian. So, at any rate, I don't remember where I was going with that, but, it had to do with, so the bishops. So we recognize all of that. It's just that they're not in unity with Rome. Mainly, at this point, mainly because of the issue of the Pope. What's the Pope's role in the Church? With respect to, for example, the Patriarch of Constantinople, he wants to think about himself as being one among them. The Pope is one among equals, the other patriarchs, Alexandria and Antioch, Constantinople. And in the Catholic Church, we recognize the Pope as primacy of power and authority within the Church. So that's the biggest issue separating us at this point, but not the only one. Okay, any other questions? All right. That's great. I love the questions, but time-wise, we're not doing well at all. So here we go. All right. I need to start skipping through there. That's just a map to kind of give you the geography of the split between East and West. We're going to run right through that right now. Okay, so here's our first saint of the day, of the night, St. Benedict of Norcia. I was going to read you his biography. It's not that long, but it's got so much good stuff in it. But I'm not going to do that. We're going to have to summarize. So the two saints we're focusing on tonight, one kind of comes into the beginning of this period that we're calling the Middle Ages, one at the end. So both of them, again, like Augustine, sort of transition figures. Benedict of Norcia, known as the father of Western monasticism. All right, so a lot of what I wanted to talk about tonight, although I probably got about 5 minutes to do it, so, was monastic life, the role of monks and nuns, monasticism within the church. Now, this may seem like something that isn't terribly important or terribly relevant to 21st century Catholics, because most of us, maybe the people in this room are an exception, I don't know. Even in my lay pastoral ministry classes, though, I've always been surprised by how many people have absolutely no exposure or knowledge whatsoever of monasticism, monastic life in the church. So we've got to say a little bit about it, because to understand the Middle Ages, you've got to understand monasticism. It is the preeminent churchly institution, arguably other than the papacy maybe, within the medieval church, and has this lasting impact on the church. Monasticism is still around. It's clearly not as prominent or as influential as it was through the Middle Ages. But through this medieval period, monasticism really set the tone for the church, and much of what it brought to the church has trickled down into the church more generally. So we're all kind of heirs of the monks, even if we don't think of ourselves that way. So what is monasticism basically? Well, it's the practice of it begins in Egypt, actually, in the East, with St. Anthony of Egypt. And Anthony went out from civilization, from the cities, okay, and went out into the desert and began to fast and pray and live by himself. It was following the model of John the Baptist and Jesus himself when they went out into the desert for periods of fasting and prayer. And this was thought to be a way to get closer to God, closer to Jesus, to improve one's relationship with Jesus Christ, and to as a means to sanctity, okay, as a means of sanctification. This was the quickest and best way. I don't want to say easiest because it wasn't an easy life, but separating oneself from the world. So that's the basic idea of monastic life. Now, Anthony did not start the kind of communal monastic institutions that we become familiar with in the West, and that's why we talk about Benedict as being the founder of Western monasticism, because he takes monastic life in the East and gives it a kind of Western spin, if you will. And most importantly, what Benedict does, you can see his years there, late 5th, early 6th century. Most importantly, he writes a rule. He writes a kind of constitution or a rule of life for the monastic life, which has its center phrase, maybe you've heard before, ora et labora, which is pray and work. Okay, pray and work. That was the theme of Western monastic life. Again, that this was the best means towards sanctification, living a life that was rooted in these two practices. And so from the beginning, the monks in the West, many of whom were Benedictines, we still call them that today, Benedictines, okay? Obviously after St. Benedict, they practiced centrally these two things, prayer and work. So, prayer, on the prayer front, if you will, well, the liturgy of the hours, anybody familiar with the divine office? Vespers and Compline and all that, okay? That came to us from the monks. The monks who started that practice in the monasteries that Benedict founded. Liturgical music. Now, we don't do a lot of Gregorian chant these days, although it's coming back in some places, like Holy Angels, we're doing a little more of it. But it was the monks who really initiated and popularized this particular form of liturgical music, which was not just the dominant, but the exclusive form of liturgical music for about 1,000 years. Okay? And then we added polyphony to the mix. But we never really abandoned chant until after the Second Vatican Council. That's another story. We didn't completely abandon it. But so, in these ways, the liturgical practice of the church, which of course is central to Catholicism, right, and shapes everyone's life, that was shaped by the practice of the monks. They did a lot more than that. Okay, I gotta get through my slides. Normally I do this. This was the most famous monastery that Benedict founded was Monte Cassino, which is in Italy. It was destroyed during World War II by Allied bombs and then rebuilt. That's what it looks like today. This, I'll leave that one up for you to look at. This is kind of the geography of monastic life. So don't worry about the red and the blue. That's not important. Different kinds of monasteries. The point of this slide is to show you how universal the presence of monasteries in Europe was. There's no date on this slide, but it's after the Cistercian Reform. So we're going to say, let's say this is 11th or 12th century, okay, in Christian Europe. And as you can see, all over the place, and in some places extremely, densely populated with monasteries. It was monasteries, remember, we're in the period after the fall of Rome. Okay, this is sometimes called the Dark Ages in European history. I don't particularly like that term. It's actually out of favor with historians, secular historians as well as religious historians. The Dark Ages is really a kind of, it was a Protestant historiographical invention of the 19th century to try to denigrate the period of time when the Catholic Church was the dominant institution in Europe. So, the term isn't totally devoid of meaning. It is this time when kind of the Roman Empire had fallen, it wasn't clear what was going to take its place. There was a kind of political chaos in some ways, and there was a kind of reversion in terms of literacy and learning and so forth, to some extent. But it wasn't the kind of period of utter and complete ignorance and superstition that has been made out to be. So, during this period, and here's the story, monastic life. This is what helped to make it not the Dark Ages, okay? It was the monks first and foremost, in some cases, in some places, they were the only institution that kept alive the learning, the literacy, the heritage of Western civilization as it had come through ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So it was the monks who taught reading and writing. They ran educational institutions. It was the monks who literally copied the books, literally helped the learning of the Roman Empire survive and of Greek philosophy survive through the Middle Ages. Obviously, no printing press, right, until the 1400s. So when there were books, how were they created? They were created by writing by hand. Who's got time to do that in the Middle Ages? When you're busy farming your land, right? Or you're busy fighting battles or whatever. Well, the monks had time to do it. So they copied all kinds of manuscripts of all kinds of the Roman historians, the Greek philosophers, and so on. Arguably, even more importantly, they copied this book, the Bible, which is pretty important in Christian life, right? Where would we be without the Scriptures? Well, it was the monks who kept handing the Scriptures down from generation to generation by copying them and often enough making an art form of it. That's what you see in front of you. This is probably the most famous illuminated manuscript surviving from the Middle Ages. It's called the Book of Kells. I think it's in Dublin somewhere. Trinity College?
It's
Yes.
beautiful.
Yeah. You've seen it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because they in there, they enlarged, a lot of it on the wall so you can see it, the documents there, but so you can see it just as you walk through.
Yeah. So, and I just added that quote today, so I forgot I had it there. You can see there John Vidmar, Dominican, the Catholic Church through the ages for a period of time. He said that monasticism was Western culture. So we've talked about its role in literature, the philosophy of Western culture, the Scripture, but there's more to it than that. This is just more of a side note. St. John's Bible. So the monks, going back to Benedictines again, right? They're still around. There's monks in St. John's, Minnesota, associated with St. John's University of Minnesota, and they decided, I don't know when, maybe 30 years ago, they started the project, that they would revive this practice of illuminated manuscripts. So they created an entire Bible by hand with the calligraphy, whatever you call it, and illuminated it. And parts of it were on display here in Cartagena a few years back. And then the monks were also important in both the survival of and also improvements in technology and farming and things like winemaking and beer making. So you can see the quote I have there. Some of you have heard this before here. Hilaire Belloc, wherever the Catholic sun doth shine, there's always laughter and good red wine. Or in this case, the liqueur, chartreuse, or beer, or whatever. This is also part of the Catholic tradition, okay, on a lighter note. But there were actually technological advances that took place as the monks were brewing and fermenting these various beverages. So this is chartreuse, which the color, you probably heard the color, right? The color comes from the liqueur, if I'm not mistaken. The liqueur came first. And the monks of the Grand Chartreuse, this is one of the prominent monasteries in Europe, it's in France. They created chartreuse in, I think it was the early 1700s. It's a top secret recipe of 130 different herbs that come from the Chartreuse Valley. And there are two monks that know the recipe. One dies, the surviving one passes it on to another one, so there's two. If two of them die at the same time, I don't know what happens. There's a contingency plan for that. So they must have it safe somewhere, I don't know, but that's the story anyway. This is the secret recipe that's handed on. And then I already talked about the music a little bit. You guys are going to miss out on my 10-minute musical tour of church history, which I sometimes give, but no CDs tonight. So here's the last point I wanted to cover. Oh, Dan didn't come tonight, did he? Dan Freitag, not here? Oh. We were talking about the architecture last week, so this was gonna be for him, but that's okay. We can all enjoy it. So this is I guess the second to last point I want to make about the monks. Okay, they also contributed to the architecture of the church and of Europe more generally, Western civilization. Mont Saint-Michel from the 11th century. This is one of the earliest examples of what we now call Gothic architecture. All right, as you can see, this stunning building in a stunning setting, this little island off the north coast of France. This began as a monastery, all right? So it was the monks that also gave us Gothic architecture, which was taken up and practiced by all sorts of folks in the Middle Ages, and they gave us all sorts of magnificent buildings like Chartres and Winchester Cathedral. So it wasn't just in France, it was also in England. Paul Johnson, a British historian, in his History of Art, says the medieval cathedrals of Europe are the greatest accomplishment of humanity in the whole theater of art. I'm sure some people will dispute that statement, but I tend to believe it. Cologne Cathedral, so also in Germany, examples of Gothic architecture. That one was being worked on for about 500 years. They finally finished it. This is, let me show you this one first. This is Barcelona, so Spain also, the Gothic style went all around the world. And in fact, probably if I were to ask most of you in here, if I said, I'll give you a piece of paper and I said, draw a picture of a church, you'd probably draw something that approximated a Gothic church. Okay? And the reason for that is not necessarily medieval Europe. The reason for that is there was a Gothic revival in the United States in the 19th century, late 19th and early 20th century. And so all the churches built during that, many of the churches built during that period were built in this, they don't look like this exactly, but it's the basic idea, with the pointed arches and the tall spires and all of that. And so we tend to associate Gothic architecture with churches, actually, because as a function of that revival in the 19th century. Previously, it had been thought of, again, after the time of the Reformation, had been thought of as a uniquely Catholic architecture. But in the 19th century, in the U.S., that changed, and so we've got lots of Protestant churches that are also in the Gothic style. Okay, this is something that I talk about when I have more time, but we've got 10 minutes left. Yikes. That's a kind of modern version, a kind of fusion of modernism and Gothic architecture. That I think is fascinating. The whole story is fascinating about Tony Gaudí, but if you're interested in this stuff, look him up. Barcelona, really neat story. A holy man, probably on his way to sainthood. Okay, that's all I'm going to. I'll say one more thing about the monks, and then we'll move on. So besides everything I just said, the importance of the monks to the Middle Ages, they were also the most important missionaries of the medieval period. So we go back to this slide, which you saw last week, but I put it up there again, because it shows us not just the spread of Christianity in the first 3 centuries, but also during the medieval period. And if you look at the way that spread occurred across the Mediterranean region there, and then into Europe and into Northern Europe, a lot of that is the work of monks. Okay? I don't have time to go into details, but basically monks, especially coming out of England and Ireland, they started to evangelize or re-evangelize, as the case may be, the old Roman Empire in places like France and Spain and Eastern Europe and Germany, which had resisted, especially Eastern Germany, which had resisted up to that point Christianization. It was the monks who finally achieved that. People like St. Boniface, probably familiar with, the apostle of Germany. Benedict died in the mid-6th century. We're going to go all the way up to Catherine of Siena. In the 14th century. I was also going to read you this biography. There's so much good stuff in here. Can't do that. So let me just give you the points I was going to highlight from Catherine's life. The larger point here is that I think I conveyed it last week without stating it explicitly. Figures like Paul and Augustine and Benedict, and as we'll see in a second, Catherine, we recognize them as saints in the church. We recognize them primarily because, why? Because they displayed heroic virtue, right? Because they were extremely holy people. They achieved a level of sanctification that we all want to emulate. That's why they're saints. But saints are also historical figures, not just in the sense that they lived in the past, but that they had a role in history, and that the secular history of Europe, of Western civilization, of every part of the world touched by Christianity, is also a function of the effect that the saints had on history. And so I hope you see the way in which people like Augustine and Benedict influenced the history not only of the church, but also the world more generally. And Catherine of Siena is a great example of this as well. An unlikely figure to be a world historical influence. She was a middle-class woman in the 1300s who was a Dominican tertiary, so a third-order Dominican. Had no official position in the church, was not an ordained priest, bishop, or anything else. She was simply a really holy and dynamic woman who made her mark on history and on the church in many ways. So Catherine was known for many things, among them her intense spirituality and her intense charity. She was a mystic. You can see there this depiction from the 18th century, the ecstasy of St. Catherine. She experienced visions of Jesus and mystical experiences. But she also had one foot planted firmly in the world. And an example of that is her interaction with the popes of the day. And in particular, there was a controversy going on at the time of Catherine's life, which began as what's known as the Avignon papacy, which is that the popes had moved, long story, but the popes had moved out of Rome and were living in a French city called Avignon. Okay? And this created all kinds of problems. Theologically, right? The Pope is the Bishop of Rome, is supposed to be there where Peter died. That's the whole point, St. Peter's Basilica, and all that. France was also the rising and leading political power of the day, and a bunch of the cardinals were French, and then the Pope was living in France, and it just looked like the church had become a wing of the French state. Okay? This was not a good thing for universal Christianity. And so Catherine started writing to the Pope, Gregory XIII, and she urged him in no uncertain terms. She played on his conscience. Okay? She said, you must go back to Rome. He finally gave in. He returned to Rome largely through, there's always lots of causes for things, but largely, I think, through the exhortation of Catherine of Siena. He returned to Rome, and there was a whole other problem with schism as an anti-pope was elected, and so on and so forth. I tell that story in the longer version. We don't have time for it. But suffice it to say that Catherine had this enormous impact on the trajectory of church history simply by being who she was, by being a holy and respected person. And even though she had no formal power or no formal authority, she was able to exert this authority over arguably the most powerful person in Europe at the time, the Pope. The papacy was the preeminent institution in Europe. The other thing I want to mention about Catherine is I did mention that she was a Dominican tertiary. Now, the Dominican order was a kind of new departure in Catholic religious life at the time. In the 13th century, you had the founding of 3 new religious orders, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and the Carmelites. Okay? These are collectively known as the Mendicant orders. And this was a continuation, so we go back to the importance of monasticism. Okay? They are following in some respect on the pattern, the model set by monastic life, but they're also adapting it for new needs and new times. And so figures like St. Francis and St. Dominic, they take the monastic rule, they adapt it, they turn it into a more active, still a consecrated religious life. Okay, Dominicans and Franciscans take the vows of poverty, chastity, obedience, but they're more active outside the monastery now. And this frees them up for all kinds of charitable works, like hospitals, care for orphans, the poor, the widows, for all of the vulnerable groups that are there in medieval Europe. It frees them up for educational work, and we still know today Franciscan and Dominican institutions of learning. My undergraduate degree is from a Franciscan university. So Franciscans and Dominicans continue in the tradition of the Benedictines, as I say, adapt, renew this form of monastic life, and push it forward into the future, and still, as I say, having an impact all the way down to the present. Francis and Dominic, we can't talk more about them. Oh, I did promise to talk about Islam. So this was another piece of Catherine's life. She was, when she was in communication with the popes, part of that was trying to gin up interest in a new crusade. Okay? We haven't talked about the Crusades yet. That was also an important part of the Middle Ages. Just a couple of minutes about that. So this was about 1300. The Crusades were actually, they had pretty much petered out. Okay? The Crusades started earlier, at the end of the 12th century. It was this series of military expeditions from Christian Europe into the Muslim Middle East to try to recapture the Holy Land. So the story there is that what? Where did these Muslims come from, right? Where did this Islamic Empire come from? Well, that's the story of the rise of Islam, and in particular the Prophet Muhammad. You can see his years there. In very brief, Islam has its beginning basically in 630, when Muhammad takes Mecca, okay, 630. By the mid-640s, 10, 15 years later, the most extraordinary thing in all of religious history, Islam has spread throughout much of North Africa. It's spread throughout the entire Middle East. It's conquered the old Persian Empire. The Nestorian Christians, Zoroastrianism, all of that is on its way out. It's conquered much of the Middle East, including parts of Asia Minor. This is the cradle of historic Christianity. Okay? Palestine and Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. The Arabian Peninsula, of course. You can see the quote I have there from Warren Carroll, a Catholic historian, who says there's nothing like it in the history of the world, this rapid spread. And so this is important, not just for medieval Christianity, but I think all of us, Americans in the 21st century here in the West, would recognize that the rise of Islam has an ongoing impact, right, on our own lives. There is, from the beginning, there is tension at least, often conflict, often armed conflict, between Islamic civilization and Christian civilization. The Crusades are just one chapter in that, but it's ongoing throughout the Middle Ages, and we even see it renewed in our own day. And for Christians who live in Islamic lands, at least in many Islamic nations, it's an issue that's very live right now. You see this, I don't know how much you follow religious news in Africa, or even secular political news in Africa, but it's a very big question in many parts of Africa, in places like Nigeria, that are more or less evenly split between Muslims and Christians, and there is constant violence, bloodshed, kidnappings, and all the rest. So, big question going forward. It has its start here in the Middle Ages, but it comes all the way down to the present. Big question, what is the relationship between Islam and Christianity? Can these two religions, civilizations get along? Is there a way? And there's the story of some of this can be told through actually the history of buildings, but I got to wrap this up, so I'll do this really quickly, and then we'll move on to questions and discussion, if you guys have any. Further questions. This is Cordoba Cathedral, which is in southern Spain. The whole story of Islam in Spain is a big, interesting one. The Reconquista, as Spain was gradually, we still think about Spain. Probably, if you think about Spain, if you think about what is the religion of Spain, you say Catholicism, right? It's changing. It's largely secular, like many European nations, but certainly historically Catholic. Well, in the 600s, it wasn't Christian. It wasn't Catholic. It was Islamic. And then there was a long, hard battle as Christian kingdoms pushed the Islamic Empire out of Spain. And this is actually told in, I think this story is told in the architecture of Cordoba Cathedral. You can see the exterior there, not Gothic, but some other style that I don't know. Maybe if you know the title of it, share it. But it looks like a Christian or a Catholic church, right? That's the exterior. There's the interior. What does that look like? Mosque. That looks like a mosque. That is recognizably Islamic architecture. That's because the interior was constructed and decorated by Muslims during the time when Muslims ruled southern Spain. And then that exterior, the facade, was put on over that after the Christians had reconquered Spain. Okay, that's just Avignon. So, all right, I really had to race through some of that. I apologize for that, but I knew it was going to be that way. When I was going over my notes earlier today, I thought there's no possible way we can do this, but there it is, for better or for worse. Any questions or anything in particular that interests you? Anything I didn't talk about? There's anything that I didn't talk about, you came thinking, oh, I want to know this about the Middle Ages. Darn, you didn't say a word about it. Feel free, now's your chance. You've got 10 minutes.
Who was that pope that Catherine wrote to and said she was
Did I say Gregory the 13th, or did I say? I think it was Gregory the 13th, but it could have been the 12th. It's really hard for me to keep track of those popes, so I'm thinking 13th. I probably have it in my notes somewhere.
And also that when there was a map with all those monasteries, do you know what that would look like today? I mean, in comparison?
Gregory the 11th. I was wrong both times. Gregory the 11th. Okay, what it would look like today? Well, there are still, let's just get a show of hands. Who's been to a monastery ever in their lives? Okay, so you guys are pretty good with your, with your experience with monasticism. There are monasteries. Gethsemane, Kentucky is the first one that comes to mind. There's a monastery in Indiana, Benedictine monastery. So they are around, including in the United States. I don't know exactly how many there are. But once you start to look into it, you're surprised at how many there are. There are actually quite a few. And there are still lots of them in Europe. I don't know exactly what the map would look like. I'll see if I can find something on a modern map. It wouldn't look like that. Well, in particular, that's part of the story for next week, but yeah, it's really the story for next week. Let me just hint at it, though, by saying Europe goes through a period of, after the Reformation, beginning with the Reformation, goes through a period of revolution and secularization and anti-clericalism and anti-Catholicism. One of the results of which is, in most places, in most parts of Europe, monasteries are suppressed. So religious orders are banned, persecuted. Monks, nuns are forced to leave, and it never really quite recovers from that. There is some recovery later in the 19th and 20th centuries, but it never recovers from that. Places like England, monasteries are just ruthlessly destroyed, and it's never come back. So that lays in the future, but I'm sorry. The Inquisition. Oh yeah. Okay, so that's part of the story. Yeah. I'll give you a brief answer in a second. Let me say something I meant to say earlier, which is I had a slide up there that had a quote from John Vidmar, The Catholic Church Through the Ages. There's actually a new edition that it's a different color, green or blue or something. But this is the book I recommend if anyone wants a one-volume, pretty easy read of the entire scope of Catholic Church history. This is the one I recommend. I always use it in all my classes. I've always gotten really positive feedback about it. So he manages to do it in less than 400 pages, which is astounding. The new version is a little bit longer, unfortunately. But he does, one of the reasons I really like this book, I think he does a nice job of dealing with the controversial subjects like the Inquisition. So if you want something that looks very close to my take on the Inquisition, fuller version of it, you can read it here. And what that is it's an admission. It's not a glossing over of the negative elements in church history. There's a lot of ugliness in church history, lots of it. I mean, we've seen it in our own day, right? Historians are going to look back on the 21st century if you scan all that and say, wow, they needed a reformation in the 21st century. Hopefully it's underway or coming or whatever. So what we might think of as being peculiar to the 21st century, it's not really. There's been this ugliness all through church history. And so I haven't had a chance to talk a lot about some of those things, but I guess I did mention a bit, with the Avignon papacy and Western Schism and those sorts of things. So the Inquisition is not entirely defensible, at least by modern standards of recognition of people's dignity, inherent dignity and inherent freedom, and what constitutes, for example, humane punishment, and so on and so forth. There are different inquisitions in different places. The Roman Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition is the one that gets most of the press, and it was harsher than the Roman Inquisition. But even with that said, if you appreciate the role of the Inquisition within the context of the time, this is one of the big problems. This is a pet peeve for not just me, all historians. They harp on about this, right? You've got to understand the thing in the context. What people do is they rip something out of the 15th century, put it in the 21st century. They don't understand it. Well, if you understand what's going on at the time, it becomes at least comprehensible. If not totally justifiable, at least comprehensible. And so if you look at it in the context of the time, religious identity was very closely tied to national identity, and very closely tied to what we now would call national security. Okay? It was a national security issue, religion was. Which I guess, once again, we're kind of all these things kind of come back around, right? If you see the controversy that Trump started with, preventing people from entering the states from Islamic countries, that's kind of, something like that. We can sort of understand, whether you like that or not, you can kind of understand the way in which religion could be connected with national security. So it was, Spanish identity. Remember, this is during the Reconquista, when the Islamic Empire had ruled Spain, and Christianity is trying to come to terms with that. And so that's part of the story. The other thing, which Catholic apologists will often point out, is that many people who were charged with crimes of heresy or the like, they would ask to be tried by the Inquisition, which was a church court. Okay, so there was a church system of justice and there was a secular system of justice. And people would like to have what we now call the Inquisition. They like to have the church justice, because that tended to be fairer and more merciful than the secular justice. Okay? So, yes, the Inquisition looks bad if you just look at some of what they did. I think they did burn people at the stake. They did. No doubt about it. Not as many as sometimes are claimed, but they did. But people tended to fare better in that system than they did in the secular system. It was a rough world, okay? The Middle Ages. I mean, we didn't have humane prisons like we do now. It was a whole different world in terms of understandings of justice and punishment and all that sort of thing. So if you understand the Inquisition in that context, like I said, it becomes more comprehensible and at least a little bit more justifiable.
In the 10-year period that Islam spread quickly, did the Christians in those areas flee or did they convert?
Yeah. It's a different story in every place. Both, for the most part, Christians stayed put, but it depends. Some of them were martyred, okay? Some of them resisted and were martyred. Some of them resisted and retained their faith for a time. But in most places, as a generalization, Christianity all but disappeared in most of those places. Look at Asia Minor, Turkey, look at North Africa. Augustine was from Hippo, that's North Africa. These were some of the strongest, most Christian places in the 4th century, 5th century. And they are almost entirely Islamic at this point. So that was a process of attrition in a lot of cases. So you would have, Christians lived under, it wasn't a situation of religious freedom, okay? They lived under various kinds of penalties, disadvantages, extra taxes, churches. We still have this. Going back to the Copts, the experience of the Copts in Egypt, okay? The Christian minority in a Muslim majority country right now. Copts have to ask for permission to build a church from the government. If they want a church, they can't just buy a property and build it, which is what we could do in the United States, right? With nice permits and whatever. But there, it's the Islamic government saying, do we want another Christian church in Egypt? Maybe not. Probably more often than not. Okay? So that's the kind of situation that Christians face. For the most, that's a generalization. It was different. There were different Islamic empires. Some were more tolerant than others. But in general, that was the case. That Christians lived under discrimination, at least, if not persecution. And eventually, in those conditions, Christianity dies out. That's the way it works, unfortunately.
And what's the name of the book? I didn't
Oh,
catch it. I can't
The
see it.
Catholic Church Through the Ages. Vidmar, Vidmar. It's Paulus Press, which not entirely reliable. I wouldn't just recommend Paulus Press kind of in a blanket way, but this is a good one. So. It's easy to obtain online. There are copies out there on Amazon and stuff. So, yeah, if you like the shorter version, go for the first edition. The second edition is what Paul Express is selling right now. Anyone else? Yeah, go ahead.
On your timeline of the seasons,
Yeah.
the earliest one was a lot of green light.
Yeah. No, don't ask about that, David. Okay, so it's a good question. I'm just giving you a hard time. It's a more, that's really a special case. Yeah. Are you familiar? Do you know the term restorationism? Okay, so this is I can't even read it on my screen. What does it say right here? Okay, so this is after the Protestant Reformation. There's a branch of Protestantism. I think they call themselves restorationists. I don't know if that's a title that was put on them or if they embrace that themselves, but their claim is that they're returning to the practices of the early church. So they're going back to the pre-conciliar church. And this is what that's the way they conceive of their lineage. That's why it's a dotted line, because it's kind of like, it's a little bit shaky, the claim, but that's the way they understand themselves, is to be not in any of these traditions, right? But they came out of Protestantism, but they don't consider themselves Lutheran or Calvinist or whatever. They consider themselves apostolic or early Christian or something like that. That's about all I know about them, so if you want to know more, Google it. Okay? Anyone else? We're out of time, but I'm willing to take more questions if you guys want to stay. Or just come up later. Yeah, Rachel?
This might be addressed later. I don't think it's Middle Ages, but we kind of hinted at it. So you said that the Gothic architecture was really seen after the Reformation as just a Catholic thing.
Yeah.
And I know that Henry VIII had the monasteries all destroyed and wiped out in England.
Right.
But did the Church of England not take over what were formerly Catholic churches? Were they not worshiping in those Catholic structures?
Yeah, that's a good point. So that's a qualification of the generalization.
Okay.
But England would also be, the English Reformation would be somewhat distinct from the Continental Reformation,
Right.
Lutheran and Calvin. So, and that would pertain both to architecture, but also to things like liturgical practice and doctrine.
Okay.
I mean, Anglicanism is all over the place. This is kind of what characterizes it. You know, it's got all sorts of different. It's a national church. So if you're in the nation, you're an Anglican. So if you're a really, really Protestant or Calvinist Christian in England, you're an Anglican. And if you're a really, really Anglican Catholic, Christian, you're also in the Church of England. So it kind of embraces all. But yes, it took over the cathedrals, and I showed you Westminster. That's not a Catholic cathedral anymore. That's an Anglican cathedral.
And a lot of churches, I don't know if I'm just thinking modern churches, but like when I drive in a downtown and I see an Episcopalian church or an Anglican church, they look very Gothic.
Right.
So, but maybe that has to do with the Gothic revival.
Late
Thank you.
19th century. Yeah, if you would have, if you see an Episcopalian church from 1810, probably not Gothic.
Okay.
Probably not. There's always exceptions to everything. And certainly a Presbyterian, well, not Presbyterians formally, but a Calvinist, a church in the Calvinist tradition in 1810, it was not Gothic. And there's still, if you visit historical religious sites like early Presbyterian churches or whatever, you'll see they're not all Gothic style.
Which makes
It's more of a Protestant meeting house style, like what we associate maybe with Quakers or Congregationalists, or even Congregationalists had started building Gothic churches in the late 19th century. But, yeah.
During the period of monasticism, what did the church look like before the everyday Catholic? How was the faith practice?
Good question. Okay. Once again, it depends where you are, but let's say we're focused on medieval Europe. So, can you picture like something you've seen in movies about feudalism or serfdom? Serfs and manors and castles and knights and all that. Picture that. That's medieval Europe. So that's the average, I mean, almost everybody was Christian. So the knights were Christians, and the serfs were Christians, and the merchants were Christians, and so it kind of much depended on where you fell in that hierarchy. But what do you want to like liturgical practice, or what? Give me more specifically what you want to know about.
What did the church, what did the ordinary Catholic, what was their way of life, or what was their worship at that time?
Okay.
There was a mass.
So more focused on religiously speaking. The Mass would have looked much like, we're covering 1,000 years here, so there was developing the liturgy, as there always has been, so it didn't necessarily look exactly the same with the entire course. But as a generalization, if you remember what the old Mass looked like, Tridentine Rite, pre-Vatican II, okay, that's pretty much what it looked like in most places. Mass was in Latin. The music was chant, as I indicated earlier. If it was a sung Mass, it was a low Mass. There was no music. People did not read Scripture on their own because either they weren't literate, which was often the case, or they didn't own a Bible, because Bibles were extremely expensive and hard to come by because they had to be copied out by hand. So that creates a scarcity automatically.
Sacraments, were there, you didn't have the 7 sacraments.
Yeah. These are all big questions. Okay, so we had the essentials of the 7 sacraments. There was marriage in the medieval church. Some will say that the sacrament of marriage was created by the Council of Trent, which we're talking about 16th century, 1500s, okay? That's not entirely untrue, but it's not entirely accurate either. The sacrament of marriage was fully defined and more fully articulated at the Council of Trent, and the canon law surrounding marriage was articulated at the Council of Trent. But there was certainly the concept of sacramental marriage predated the Council of Trent. So all the details of the development of all the 7 sacraments, I don't know. I confess ignorance. I mean, there's a story for each of them. But I think I suggested this last time, that if you look at, for example, the Acts of the Apostles, you can find, again, the essential elements of most of the sacraments you can actually find described in the Acts of the Apostles. I don't know about marriage. I'm not sure about that one. But holy orders, when the apostles laid hands on other men to make them what we would now call priests, deacons, whatever, the laying on of hands, the sacrament of holy orders. That was there from the beginning. Again, exactly the same. I went down to the ordination in Cincinnati the other week. Obviously, they weren't doing the ordination like that in the first century. Okay, but the laying on of hands, the essentials of it were there. Communion, that's part of the whole Mass discussion, right? The words, as I suggested last time, the words of institution, the words of consecration were the same. Paul reports them. We still repeat those same words. So there was much that was similar. But of course, over the course of 2,000 years, there's going to be development and change. So without any question, what else have I missed? Baptism, we see that described in the Acts of the Apostles, and that's the same. It's water, I baptize you in the name of the Father, and Son, and Holy Spirit. That one was pretty simple. From the beginning, it's remained fairly simple. We've added a few things here, I guess. What else?
Reconciliation.
Reconciliation, well, that's an interesting one. Again, I don't know the whole story there, but my understanding is that in the first century, confession was public, so it was a public confession and then public penance. That's the way the sacrament was conducted. So private confession came along later. Exactly when and how that developed, I'm sorry, I just don't know that story. But personally, I'm glad it went that way. The Irish monks? Okay. Could be. I don't know that story. All right. Anyone else? Thanks for hanging around. This is great. I could stay all night, but,
so next week, we'll get to this break, the Protestant Reformation, and forward. Cool.